Thanks very much indeed, Matt, and thanks everybody for coming here. It's brilliant to see people coming on a Thursday morning, which is quite a tall ask. Now, yesterday I went to a school in South Wales to teach an ecology lesson, and I do this from time to time for purely self-indulgent reasons that they are among the best days of my life, taking the kids out into the woods and showing them stuff. And so we did a great session on detritivores and saprophytes and the carbon cycle and everything. But I've gone to this school in particular because I was really interested in what it's doing. It's a very new school. It was set up in September, and it's the first school in Britain which is non-fee paying, which is founded on democratic principles. And the idea is that the children decide how the classrooms are to be designed, how the lessons are to be taught, how the balance between being indoors and outdoors, a whole load of things to do with the administration of the school. And of course, this is generally, people would regard this as a catastrophic idea. So I was very interested to see how it works in practice. And after our session, and we had lunch, I then went to sit in on their first lesson after lunch, which was one of their debates. And it just happened, and this was nothing to do with my presence, that the debate was about whether or not the school should go vegan. Now, I know from bitter experience that this is about the most emotive issue in human society, what we should eat. And generally such discussions end up with a consensus that it's perfectly all right to take another life as long as that life is another participant in the debate. They get really, really horrible very quickly indeed, whether online or offline. And I just sat and watched this debate with absolute astonishment, because the kids were listening to each other, they were making their points with great clarity, they weren't trying to knock each other down, they were listening, thinking about it, and then responding carefully, and actually responding to what people had said rather than just diving in with their own agendas. And afterwards I spoke to the woman who founded the school, who I think is one of the great visionaries in British politics, an extraordinary new thinker, and said to her, how on earth was that possible? I mean, that is the most mature debate I've ever seen on this subject, and these were 8 to 12-year-olds. And she said, oh, you should have been here in September, there would have been blood on the carpet. When this school was founded, these debates were horrible. They were totally vicious. And I said, so what's changed? She said, what's changed is that democracy has become a habit. And that, I think, is what needs to change everywhere. Now, I could stand up here and talk about a lot of issues which are also crucial, about how we should reform our centralised power structures. We could talk about electoral reform and the ridiculousness of our first-past-the-post system, how grossly unfair that is. We could talk about the House of Lords, and present company accepted the ridiculousness of that system and how that desperately needs reform too. We could talk about this crazy situation where in a union of 4 nations we have 3 national assemblies and 1 supreme authority. We could talk about the royal prerogative. We could talk about the clash between parliamentary sovereignty and prime ministerial authority. There are so many ways in which this crazy 19th century system needs to be reformed. And all those are crucially important. But far more important, I feel, than the reform of our central power structures is the decentralisation of power, to enable democracy to become a habit. And by decentralisation, I'm not just talking about devolution to other authorities, be they the national assemblies, local authorities, regional assemblies, whatever, especially if those authorities replicate some of the things which are desperately wrong in Westminster. We need that too. We do need that devolution, but it's not nearly enough. What we need is a far more radical devolution, which I call political rewilding. Well, of course I call it that because I'm obsessed by rewilding. But it's actually highly relevant. And the field trip on detritivores and saprophytes and the carbon cycle, I think is also highly relevant to my political interests. Because what we see is the same issues appearing in many different fields, and they can basically be summarized as treating complex systems as if they were simple ones. So what we see in British conservation all too often is an attempt to beat ecosystems into submission. An ecosystem is a highly complex system with all the characteristics of complex systems. It's adaptive, it has emergent characteristics, it has spontaneous, dynamic self-organization, it has flows of energy and flows of interactive flows which can't be predicted from the outset. It's got all these fascinating, extraordinary characteristics, which means that there is no fixed outcome. The process, to a large extent, is the outcome in a complex dynamic system like an ecosystem. And yet, in so many nature reserves around Britain, you've got a management plan which says the grass in this park should be 10 centimetres high, this species should be present, this one should be absent, over here the heather should be 30 centimetres high, we should expect to find the following and not the following. And in order to maintain that highly prescriptive regime, they use cutting and burning and grazing, all the things that when we see them abroad we recognise as environmental destruction, but here we call it protection. Because you just have to constantly beat that system into submission to ensure that it does what you want it to do. And as a result, what we see is that model repeatedly fails. That a simplified system turns out to have no resilience. It's highly susceptible to climate breakdown, it's highly susceptible to invasive species because it's got loads of ecological gaps which can be filled by grey squirrels or Japanese knotweed or cane toads or whatever your invasive species might be. It can't sustain itself, and the intervention has to become more and more extreme in order to meet the terms of the management plan. But if instead of saying that this intensive stewardship is essential to maintain the ecosystem, you sit back and say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let the ecosystem do what it wants to do, and by the way, the 1,000 flowers blooming is not in the actual management plan, and maybe it won't be flowers, it might be fungi, but rather than being prescriptive, to allow that dynamic, spontaneous organisation to assert itself, suddenly you see all this unexpected, unpredicted stuff happening, very often a massive increase in the diversity and abundance of nature, species which you wouldn't expect to have found anywhere appearing as if from nowhere because they just managed to migrate to that area, and massively improved outcomes for nature. So there's about 200 Dutch rewilding sites now because they've been pulling back the dikes from the rivers to allow the rivers to flood without harming anyone. When as with climate breakdown, we see more and more water coming down them. And the result of that is that every month now, they are crossing species off their red data list in the Netherlands. It's quite an extraordinary thing, and they're species which are completely unexpected. So we're now beginning to see rewilding becoming a really big thing in ecological circles. And I want it to become a really big thing in political circles. What I want to see is, instead of treating society as if it were a simple linear system which can be controlled and managed from the centre, we engage in what some people call radical trust in allowing spontaneous dynamic self-organisation to emerge. And when it's done properly, instead of, as some people predict, all sorts of horrible things coming, because don't most people in this country want to bring back hanging? And aren't the majority going to turn on the minorities? What we tend to see is it has exactly the opposite effect. Because at the moment in our highly simplified system, that system is not resilient at all. It loses its dynamism, it's highly susceptible to collapse, as many northern towns in this country can testify, and it's got very little capacity for self-regeneration, and it's full of ecological gaps into which the ethno-nationalists and the supremacists, the invasive species, if we like, of the political ecosystem can move, filling those gaps which have been left by a system which seeks to treat one of the most complex of all ecosystems, human society, as if it were a simple one. And what I want to see us doing is looking at the most exciting examples of dynamic, spontaneous self-organisation around the world and drawing lessons for how we could apply those to British politics. For me, the standout one is the participatory budgeting programme in Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, particularly between the years 1989 to 2004, where throughout those 15 or so years, we saw a radical transformation in the life of that city, which, like many Brazilian cities, was incredibly divided and unequal, huge rates of exclusion and marginalisation, and it was pretty well completely captured by the mafia, or by different tranches of mafias, really. There was an outright mafia, then there was a political clientelism, which really is a mafia in everything but name, which basically mopped up all the infrastructure projects and, oh, my brother-in-law turns out to be the perfect person to build this bridge to nowhere, which nobody actually needs, so we're going to pour half the infrastructure budget into this. We see it happening in cities all over the world, that sort of clientelist capture of public budgets. And the radical PT government, Partido dos Trabalhadores, in Porto Alegre, when it came to power in 1988, I think said, we're not going to put up with this any longer, we're going to do something completely new, unprecedented, worldwide on this scale, which is to put the capital spending budget in the hands of the people. And they designed this extraordinary deliberative system, which was designed with the people. Again, from the very outset, this was a participatory project where they said, we're going to have this system, much like the sort of Murray Bookchin idea of political ecologies, where you are going to devolve upwards from the smallest possible political units, decisions up to the biggest ones. And it led to a situation in which 50,000 people a year were participating in decisions as to how the money was to be spent, including people from the most excluded and marginalised groups. It turned out to be a far better way of engaging marginalised people than mainstream politics is, a purely representative system is. And the result was a complete reallocation of spending priorities. And within a few years, Porto Alegre was the state capital in Brazil which ranked highest on the Human Development Index. Massive reductions in maternal mortality, in infant mortality, massive improvements in sanitation, in clean water, in primary healthcare, primary education, in public transport. And it led to the extraordinary situation, which no political scientist would ever have predicted, of people taking to the streets to demonstrate for their taxes to be raised. And the reason for this is that when people trusted how the money was going to be spent, because they were in charge of that spending, they could see that their money could go a lot further when it was spent collectively than when it's spent individually. Because if, for instance, you're trying to get to work in the morning, you could buy yourself a $3,000 banged up old car and spend 2 hours in the traffic jam each way getting to work. Alternatively, you could put your $200 contribution into the new monorail system, which is going to get you there in 20 minutes. It's a far more efficient use of that money to spend it collectively through a municipal program than to try to solve your problems individually. We see another standout example in Reykjavik, the Better Reykjavik program, brought in after by a progressive city government after Iceland's phenomenal collapse following its massive overextension into exotic financial instruments leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. The whole country really fell apart and they thought, right, never again. And so the city government instituted this extraordinary program whereby every month anyone who wants to can put forward an idea for the city's improvement. And everybody else can then vote on those ideas. And the top 15 ideas go to the city government, which has to either accept them or produce a very good reason why they should be rejected. And that very good reason turns out to be crucial for public trust in the system, because people realise they're being listened to, that it's not just being rejected out of hand. And that has led to according to Icelandic people I know, to a radical transformation of the city. It's a completely different place to what it was before, in terms of physical infrastructure and the experience of being there, but also in terms of the whole political feel of being an active citizen within Reykjavik. A similar thing is now happening in Madrid with the Decide Madrid programme. And there's sort of similar, though not quite such a comprehensive programme in Taiwan with the V-Taiwan project. But there's several of these things happening around the world, and we should be learning these lessons. Instead, we have this purely representative system, which is based on the principle of presumed consent. We have a government which asks us to vote once every 5 years, and maybe in a referendum once every few decades. And then it takes that result as a mandate to do whatever it wants. And it says, well, you voted for our manifesto, this thing is in the manifesto, therefore you have given us consent to do this thing. So, well, I never read that bit, and even if I read it, I never understood it, and I certainly didn't vote for that, and by the way, I didn't vote for you anyway. And by the way, this other thing you want to do wasn't in the manifesto at all, and yet you say you got consent to do that as well? How? When? When did I say you could do that? We don't accept presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? It's an extraordinary idea, isn't it? Now, I don't want to get rid of representative democracy, but I want to temper it with deliberative democracy, the best form of participatory democracy. That's what I saw at the school yesterday, deliberative democracy, respectful listening, respectful engagement. Instead of an adversarial system where you're trying to knock your opponent down, people coming together to solve their common problems. And boy, do we need some of that in Britain today. Thank you.